Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, which is the third in a collaborative SAMHSA VA webinar series entitled Celebrating and Elevating American Indian and Alaska Native Service Members, Veterans, and Their Families. Next slide, please. I'm Stacy Owens, and I serve as the Military and Veterans Affairs Liaison for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. One of our initiatives at SAMHSA is to partner with Department of Veterans Affairs on efforts to support community-based suicide prevention for veterans. And I will turn it over to my VA colleague, Cicely Burrows McElwain, to say hello and give us a little bit of a background on this partnership. Cicely?
Thanks so much, Stacy, and good morning or good afternoon to all of you that are joining us today for this installment of our webinar series. We're via collaboration with these amazing speakers that we have in store for everyone. We are looking forward to learning a lot, hearing some amazing wisdom from the speakers today, and also taking this kind of webinar to wrap up a series of education and learning that many of you might have been with us for over the last several months. So again, we're honored to have the partnership that we have ongoing with SAMHSA and the folks here today. We'll get started with just a little bit about that partnership. If we can go to the next slide, we want to remind folks that obviously the webinar is being recorded, and we are excited to have the speakers that we have here. You'll hear so much about them in just a few moments, but we did want to give just the general disclaimer that you see on the screen here about the views, opinions, and content expressed being those of the speakers themselves and not necessarily reflective of the VA or SAMHSA. If we go to the next slide, this is a visual representation of the relationship between SAMHSA and the VA and our collaborative work through our interagency agreement and SAMHSA's Service Members, Veterans, and Their Families Technical Assistance Center. Together, we collaboratively plan for meeting the needs of service members, veterans, and their families, and in particular have done some great work over the last year and a half with a number of subject matter experts across the country for American Indian and Alaska Native groups and organizations that have helped to inform some of the programming you're going to hear today. We're really excited about this ongoing partnership and hope that not only this effort, but our future efforts together will result in some wonderful resources for our communities to better support our veterans and their families. So thanks so much, Stacey. I'll hand it back to you, and thanks to the amazing panelists that we have that you'll hear from in just a moment. We appreciate everyone taking your time to join us for today.
Thanks, Cicely. This webinar is being supported by SAMHSA's Service Members, Veterans, and Their Families Technical Assistance Center, which we call the SMVF TA Center for short. The TA Center partners with states, territories, and communities to increase behavioral health support for the SMVF community. The TA Center works to strengthen military and civilian collaborations, provide a centralized platform for jurisdictions to connect and share, increases awareness of and access to resources for SMVF behavioral health systems of care, supports coordinated responses, and encourages implementation of best and promising practices. Next slide, please. The TA Center provides that support through several avenues, including academies for jurisdiction-based teams, crisis intercept mapping for SMVF suicide prevention, webinars like this one, as well as other types of virtual learning opportunities and connections with experts and dissemination of information and resources. Next slide, please. We certainly appreciate the speakers who will share their wisdom with you today. We also appreciate each and every one of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to celebrate and elevate our American Indian and Alaska Native service members, veterans, and their families. To carry us through the rest of the webinar and introduce our presenters, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today. Dean Dufresne honorably served in the United States Marine Corps. He's also an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, and he's really dedicated his life to supporting his fellow service members and veterans. Dean, thanks so much for moderating for us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for that, Stacy, and welcome everybody. I've been looking forward to this part of the three-part series for a long time now. We have some very engaging presenters for us today that I'm as anxious to hear about it as you all are. Thank you very much for joining. Next slide, please. a little bit of housekeeping. We got our virtual meeting space. So any questions, we ask you to enter them into the Q&A chat box, please. I'm sorry, the Q&A box there. We will field those and make sure to get those all to our presenters and get all your questions answered as we go. We will have a Q&A towards the end of the session here. The slides and recordings will be emailed to all registrants following the session as well. Next slide, please. So our learning objectives today are to illustrate the power of traditions and cultural practices in healing American Indian and Alaska Native service members, veterans, and their families. Also to examine how ceremonies and cultural practices like sweat lodges, talking circles, honor songs, and drumming all work to heal the mind, body, and soul. Next slide, please. Our presenters today, to guide us along this journey, I'd like to introduce them. Our first presenter is Barbara Aragon. Miss Aragon is a subject matter expert with SAMHSA's Tribal Training and Technical Assistance Center. In her role, she draws from over 40 years of experience working in Native communities in the continental United States, U.S. territories, and the Pacific Basin. She has a deep understanding of appropriate implementation approaches, research methodologies, and work plans for addressing social development issues and wellness in Native American communities, and provides technical assistance to community-based projects. Over the last 8 years, she has focused on suicide prevention and postvention in Native communities. Additionally, she has facilitated strategic planning sessions for Native veteran groups and has been the project manager for 2 separate projects capturing Native American veterans' digital stories. She is currently writing short stories that weave together traditional stories with modern tales to reveal the enduring power of sacred human journey. Miss Aragon is of Laguna Pueblo, Crow, and French-Canadian heritage. Also with us today, we have Mr. Ray Daw. Ray Daw is of Navajo or Dene descent, is originally from Polk County, Arizona. Polk, Arizona. A graduate from boarding school and University of New Mexico, UNM. He also served in the U.S. Army. He has been in the behavioral health field for about 35 years, working with the Navajo Nation, nonprofits, and most recently in Alaska. His work in behavioral health has been heavily towards developing Native trauma-appropriate approaches that are healing and effective in tribal behavioral health prevention, intervention, and treatment services. He also trains in motivational interviewing and historical trauma. Ray formerly directed Northwest New Mexico Fighting Back, a community alcohol prevention project in the Four Corners region of the Southwest. And finally, we have with us Mr. Ivan Sam. Ivan Sam is a Native American cultural ambassador of Veterans Art Project, a community-based arts organization serving veterans, active duty, spouses, dependents, their caregivers, and the community through process-driven deep arts engagement and art therapy. Ivan is a Navy veteran, a member of the Dene Nation, and served as an aviation electrician during the Desert Storm Iraqi freedom campaigns, where he spent 2 deployments on board aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf, along with many other duty assignments. Ivan also serves on the Secretary of Veterans Affairs Tribal Advisory Committee. With that, we're going to ask Mr. Ivan Sam to open us up today in a good way. So we'll turn it over to you, Ivan. Thank you, sir.
Oh, thank you, Dean. I just want to say a little prayer for each and every one of us. So if you just could bow your heads or just go along with the prayer. Father, Creator God, we ask that you be with us today. Ask that you look out, bless each and every one of us during this time as we open up discussions on topics of trauma, on how to support our veterans and families, and also be there to continue to look out for them each and every way. I ask that you bless each and every one of us here during this process of work that we're doing to try to find ways and healing strategies to bring healing to our veterans and also their families as well. I ask that you continue to bless each and every one of them. Look out for their family, look out for their children, look out for each and every one of their loved ones. And I ask that you look out for us that are doing the work, and I ask that you bless us in a good way. Give us the strength, the courage, the wisdom, the values to take care of one another, and also to be able to create a good program to support the ones that are in need. I ask that you be with us each and every way and guide us. Continue to bless us and keep us out of harm's way. Aho. Thank you.
You, sir. Appreciate that, Ivan. Okay, next slide. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Miss Barbara Aragon to present on warrior ceremonies. Barbara?
Thank you. And thank you for that prayer, Ivan. I really appreciate it. You know, the importance as we look at ceremonies, we want to set that stage. We want to clear that area for us to start doing this work. And so one of the things I said before I was talking to our esteemed veterans here was that I really see my role as setting a framework for the important information they're going to provide, you know. And so just a little bit of my background is I'm a mother of veteran, I'm a daughter of a veteran, all my uncles, all the men as I grew up, first on my pueblo in New Mexico. I grew up as a little girl with the walls full of basic training pictures, you know, basic training graduation. You know, that was our artwork. And you know, from World War II, you know, and they were the old kind of sepia pictures of the, and that was how I grew up. That everyone served, and that was the men at that time for that generation. And yet, as I've grown older, the females, the women warriors, have joined, and but you know, really honoring the service of Native American veterans. And so I started with this quote, and you may know Eduardo Duran. He has done a lot of work on healing from especially historical trauma. And one of the books he wrote was, you know, is about the woundedness that we have in our communities. But he has this little booklet. It's just this little, but there's a sections for veterans in there. And one of the quotes that stood out for me of that book, and when he's writing about veterans, yeah, I think is really is pertinent to the work we're doing today. And he says in there, it's important to remember that war has a spirit. And it is the spirit that needs to be balanced and restored in ceremony. And that's really what we're talking about, what ceremony does. You know, and one of the ways I describe ceremony is ceremony is so important to move us through life. You know, it's like if you're going life being a river and you are on this canoe or you're on this boat. Ceremony is like an oar, you know, and that oar hits at certain times in our life, you know, whether it be during birth, it hits and moves us out. And then it hits again during puberty ceremonies and moves us forward. And so each time that ceremony is held, it pushes us to a different place with new roles and responsibilities. And so with that, for many of our people, they enter war, and that becomes a ceremony. You know, it strikes when they're going into basic training, when they're sent off with whatever the ceremonies their tribe has done. And it moves them into that place of being a warrior, you know, from being that son, that husband, that uncle, and moves them into that place of being a warrior. And so as I read Eduardo's quote, that they move into that place of ceremony, but it also takes another ceremony to bring them out. And that's really what, you know, our veterans are going to talk about with Ray and Ivan, about moving into that place of ceremony as someone becomes a warrior, but also the importance of bringing people out so that they can be that uncle, they can be that dad, they can be, you know, that brother, they can be that spouse, you know, the sister when they come back. And so these are really essential that these ceremonies restore that balance. So I just wanted to kind of set the stage for that. So in the next slide, I wanted to talk again about how we experience trauma, and that during ceremony we really need we need to find a way to not only honor that trauma is going to occur when someone goes into the service and when someone goes into when goes into to battle, but also that the importance of coming out. And that's an area, as I spent many years, as it was mentioned in my introduction, of doing digital storytelling with veterans groups, is people really began to speak about the trauma that they experienced. But one of the first veterans, he was Don Autumn, and I got to know him very well. He served in Desert Storm. But after that, I continued to have a relationship with these veterans. And sometimes they'd come through Sacramento, or I'd be in their area and we'd have dinner or something. But this is something that Jonathan Thomas, who was in the Marines, said that I thought was really important. Uh, and he said, people are afraid to do ceremonies. And I think that's ceremonies in general in our communities, because what historical trauma has done is closed down or oppressed many of the ceremonies. And so he said something about people are afraid because they don't think they're doing it right, so they don't do it at all rather than to do it. But he said, you know, what we have to remember, it is the intention, the heart that we're doing ceremony. Maybe we don't do it exactly how it was done, like 100 years ago, but yet it's the heart and the intention that we bring to it that gives it still the power to heal. So I wanted to say those because those are really two important things that I think kind of provide a framework for what is going to be talked about. And as I thought about it and the word trauma, because I've been trained in social work, but really I'm a storyteller and a person that really appreciates the power of story and ceremony. And one of the things, I worked for the Tribal TA Center that was said as a TA provider. But one of the things I really learned about with SAMHSA was the trauma-informed elements. And so I'm going to move to the next slide. And I kind of said this here already about markers, ceremonies being markers that move us for different ceremonies. And so that is, again, what I talked about, that there's an or. And I think one of our biggest losses is that we've forgotten or don't practice ceremony because we've forgotten about the power it has to move us through life. And so going to the next one is when I started to work with SAMHSA, first as a consultant and then now as a staff person, is I learned about trauma-informed principles. And so I'm going to go over this. And for folks, who might be really familiar with those. We've done a lot of training in trauma-informed. What are the principles that need to be in place for us to heal from trauma? And so these are the ones, the 6. One is we need to feel safe. We have to be in a place of safety. We have to feel like we're away from that trauma, and now that we're safe to begin to explore. And with that, to make us safe, is that there has to be trustworthiness and transparency. We have to know that people are honest, that they're speaking their truth, that and that there are other people that understand and that they've been where we are. And that's the next one. We talk about peer support, that people that have been where we are, that understand where we've been, are there, and they're not judging or questioning. And so we can be our real selves. And with that is the next one, collaborate and mutuality, that we have to be on the same level. We have to have that kind of respect for one another. And there's not this above and below, but that we're collaborating and we're all on the same level. And that's the collaboration and mutuality. And then the next one is empowerment, voice, and choice. We have to feel empowered, but we also have to choose. make choices, feel like our voice is being heard, as we move through trauma. And then the next one, the sixth one, is the cultural, historical, and gender issues. It has to be in that context when we do our healing work. And so when I learned about this, I was thinking, this is true. But the other thing was, but we always knew this as Native people. We might not have had these terms, but what I think what we're going to hear with Ray and Ivan is we're going to see how all of these have always been in place, from the beginning of time. And I think about it for myself before I turn it over to them, was that when I go into ceremony, there has to be that safety. When you enter, whether it be in the lodge, whether they enter in the talking circle, there are certain things that I know that there are norms that are going to be in place, so that when I enter there, is that I know, this is, we're going to move in this way, or the element of the eagle feather means, that I'm speaking, so that there are all of these norms that when you go in and they're in the context of your culture, create that safety. And when I know, because I've been taught, okay, this is what you do when you go in this way, when you do this, this is the way you do it. And whether it be the men do this and the women do this, there's always that principle that make me feel I'm doing it okay. I know how to do this. And then there's that peer support. So when you're looking at, when I first started doing digital storytelling, people said, well, you're going to really have a difficult time having veterans speak. And but we created a safe space. But the other thing is, I didn't have to get veterans speaking. It was other veterans, that once they were in that space, and that we could share a digital story, or one veteran would start, then it would open up the other veterans. It was that peer support. It was that mutuality. And I always say that stories prime stories. Once someone speaks, then someone is like, oh, well, that reminds me of this, and then that story begins, and it just flows like a beautiful dance. But it has to have that peer support. And so I can just show a digital story, and I can step out of the way and say, what did you hear there? What was strong about that? And then the veterans take over. But it has to be them taking over and not me trying to make something happen. And then with just using that example of digital stories, they have to have their own voice. They have to tell that story. And Ray Daw that's going to be speaking, did a digital story, and shared his story, about his service when he was up in Alaska. And so you look at that, and you build that safety, you give that peer support, but also it's in a cultural and historical setting. And from the World War II digital stories that we did down to the Iraqi and Afghanistan, there was always discussion about how their culture, what they were grounded in, helped them during those times. Though they were thousands of miles away, that they would say, this helped me. This helped me. I would think back to what my uncle taught me. I think back to what my people taught me. I think back to that ceremony. And when I was scared, or whatever was happening, it kept me grounded. And so I just wanted to introduce these principles, because I think it's really important for us as Native people, when we see what seems to be new teachings or new concepts. They aren't. They're ancient. And we've always known this. And so with that, I want to turn it over to our veterans here to put some meat on that framework.
Hey, thank you so much for that, Barbara. I wrote down some notes myself, and some very meaningful things there. There is a question that is posed here that we will wait till the end, but I just want you to know that you're sparking some discussion already. So thank you for that. We're going to go ahead and now turn it over to Mr. Ray Daw, and he is going to give a presentation on honoring traditions and cultural practices in healing. Go ahead, Ray, take it away.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Yate, Tahastinjike. It's good to be here with you and go through this process of describing. My approach is going to be very much historical in terms of understanding traditions and cultural practices and how we apply them in these days in a healing way. So go ahead, next slide. Skip this one. No. Go ahead, next one. For my relatives, Navajo relatives, this is who I am. I am of the Kea'ani clan. That's my mother's clan, Tarrowing House. My father's clans are Tlazatlan or Many Goats. And my maternal grandfathers are Sitnachini, Blackstreet people. And my paternal grandfathers are Twitachini or Bitterwater people. In our tradition and our culture as the Net people, we are obligated to make known who we are traditionally, culturally, socially, and also there's a lot of spiritual meaning to the clans that we represent and share responsibilities to each other. So I want to make sure that I introduce myself appropriately to my Navajo relatives who are in the audience. I see a couple names. So next slide, please. This goes into who we are and what we are. Normally, we see maps of native lands before Columbus in a very different way. The native lands that are generally marked out in pre-colonization are usually boundary related. You know, they say the Lakota people were here, the Dakota people were here, the Shoshone occupied these lands, and the Cherokee had these lands. And that's really incorrect. The interactions among our people were very dynamic historically prior to colonization. And this, I think, gives a stronger depiction of how our people interrelated with each other for thousands of centuries, thousands of years at least, and how these very dynamic relationships that our peoples had across the country shaped our traditions and our cultures and our ways today. One of the things we know about, for example, is corn. What originated in Mayan country, way down south. But at the time of Columbus's landing, corn was being cultivated all across North America, and a lot of different varieties of corn. And for me, that opened up some questions around historically, how did that happen? How did corn, which came out of Mayan country down south in the Yucatan area, come to being a strong staple across Indian country in the America? And I think this map really begins to show how our people are related to each other. One of the stories I tell is that my people in Navajo, one of our most sacred sites is off the coast of California into Los Angeles area, which is hundreds of miles from Navajo land. And we hold that place, which is off the coast of Los Angeles, as one of our most sacred sites. So again, that shows to me the dynamic nature of how we interrelated each other, shared with each other, and how our cultures began to get created because of that strong interdependence that existed among Native peoples historically. Next slide. In looking at how that interrelationship and interdependence shows up our trade routes, we understand that trading across Native country, and this is only the western side of the north of the country. The eastern side of the country, you see those lines extending way up north. But we see trading routes that were established, and you see the trading routes going south into Mexico, what is now known as Mexico. You see these trading routes with hubs across different parts of western New Mexico that were very strong and vibrant. And these trading centers had a major impact, not only in terms of how I look at this and how a lot of us look at this, is that they were trading centers that were also centers of sharing culture, tradition, values, and social norms and spiritual ways. And that's a really good thing to begin to open our minds to, is how our lives were created and established before colonization. and how that shaped much of what we were before the development of reservations, which we now look at very bounded areas of land, but our people traversed and traded with each other very extensively. And consequently, like for my people, we knew who the different peoples were in different parts of North America by name. We had names for them, and intermarried with a lot of people, brought back wives, or married into different tribes, and across the centuries prior to colonization. Next slide. That dynamic relationship is expressed in this map also, where we show how some of the items that were traded across different parts of the country appeared, and how they showed up. Copper, for example, one of the major copper mining areas was around the Great Lakes area. And copper ended up being traded far south, such that before colonization, there were copper ornaments being used heavily in almost all parts of the United States that originated up north. And they migrated south towards different parts of the country. Shells from the Yucatan area and feathers from the Yucatan area showed up in all parts of North America. And that's the extent to which our people interrelated to each other. And to have that kind of dynamic relationship across regions, that means having relationships that are cordial, respectful, and friendly, and also vibrant, which means having an existence where people share and respect each other. And that kind of lifestyle existed very heavily. On the other hand, when conflicts would arise, when trading disputes happened, or families got into difficulties with each other across different parts of the region, so the process of having coexistence included resolving conflicts the best way possible. Next slide. Which meant having peace, keeping peace. Pretty much all communities that I'm aware of had a process from which peace was maintained, and those leaders in the community that were sought to mediate conflicts and disagreements held the highest places in many of the native communities across Indian country. On the other hand, on higher places of respect than people who were chosen or respected for being leaders in times of conflict. And so these two parts of attaining and maintaining peace, and the other part on resolving conflicts the best way possible, but at the same time, when conflict occurred, to have that conflict resolved in a manner where you didn't have long-standing disputes or long-standing periods of what will eventually be warfare. Otherwise, you'd end up losing those dynamic relationships. Next slide. That all changed with the beginning of colonization. And it wasn't necessarily warfare with the Euro-Americans that changed Native American life, but it was the impact of disease, where 90% of Native Americans died. We went from a population of millions and millions to a population of a couple 100,000 over a span of 450 years. And there's an impact on this. When any community loses 90% of its population, that's going to cause a major change in how those relationships within a community are affected, but also those relationships across communities become affected. When 90% of a region's population is decimated by disease, and all the different tribes in that area and all the communities in that area are affected, that's going to have an impact on trading. It's going to have an impact on sharing of culture, traditions, values, and social norms. And it's really what began to happen as a result of this. Tribes became a lot more isolated from each other. The process of sharing and trading began to diminish significantly because of 90% of the people that had lived were gone. The social structure had to change, especially as colonization began to bring in warfare as a way of life, as opposed to peaceful living as a way of life. And that is a process that began to occur over the centuries of colonization. These are the things that we don't talk about, I think, and how it is that the social norms and traditions and values of our people began to really shift into what we see and what we talk about and what we experience today in the Indian country, and how we became a lot more dependent on our families, and how we became a lot more dependent on the external processes that are here today, which is a centralized government and a process of economy that is not what our people practice. Next slide, please. With colonization, of course, begins the process of assimilation. The people that are decimated by 90% of the population end up having to choose, our ancestors ended up having to choose how to move into this larger society of non-native culture. And assimilation is a process of doing that. Many of our people chose to assimilate, which is why 90% of our people live in urban centers today. And 30% of us live within or near our traditional lands, which were called reservations. And a big factor in that assimilation of our people, where 70% of us are in urban centers, are teachings like this. And this is a sign that was posted in Winter Rock, Arizona, Navajo Nation capital, back in 1953, which taught that tradition is the enemy of progress. And the thing to remember, this is a time when Native culture, traditions, ceremony were outlawed. It was illegal to practice the Native American church. It was illegal to practice the enemy way, the beauty way, the coming of age ceremonies. It was illegal to practice the Sundance. And those were very hard times that our ancestors, as recently as 2 generations ago, had to endure and live through. So I look at the way that we are today, and I think we were very fortunate to have some of what our ancestors practiced 100 years ago. And that we have some of those ways still fairly intact in some of the Native communities across our lands. And there are some Native communities which have really moved away from the traditional cultural ways of the people and have moved more fully into assimilation ways spiritually and culturally. But this had a big impact on us. Boarding schools, which were dominant for 100 years, had a big factor in that. And this is what I think we endure today as Native people and as veterans. That affects us, in terms of choosing how we're going to conduct ourselves during military service and after military service, and how we begin to assimilate the best we can into civilian lifestyle, which is in these days not easily accomplished. Next slide, please. And this leads to a process of which we end up as behavioral health professionals, criminal justice professionals, social justice people, health professionals. We end up having to decide and determine which path is a good path for contemporary Native Americans and veterans. Although 70% of our people live in urban communities, a significantly high proportion of them go to Native American practices and ceremony as a way to maintain a balance, as a way to adjust to your American lifestyle, as a way to maintain connection to traditional, cultural, spiritual ways that are from the homelands. And so, smudging is a part of a way to attain emotional and mental balance. It ends up being part. On the other hand, we have a good portion of our people who are fairly well assimilated into the Euro-American process and the way of thinking. And that's where the DSM-5 becomes valuable and important. And so we end up having to make real clear assessments and in terms of where a person is coming from. It's not uncommon to have someone who has a foot in the Euro-American way real strongly and still have a foot in traditional cultural ways of the Native American lifestyle and traditions, and work on balancing those two ways out. And that's fine, but it means really having a good juggling act on how to support and be there for a person like that, particularly veterans. Next slide, please. There are three main processes that I believe are there in terms of how we approach wellness. We have the Euro-American way, which is heavily grounded on treatment, the DSM way. And we have a second path that is there, which is a recovery path. And even those two ways are intertwined often in terms of how they apply, such that sometimes it ends up being treatment recovery as opposed to treatment only or recovery only. And then with we have the healing ways, which come out from our traditional ceremonies, and even that ends up being like a braid. We have people who practice healing, recovery, and treatment modalities, depending on who it is that they're working with. As a behavioral health professional, it is incumbent on us, on me, for example, to be very aware of the treatment modalities that are out there and really understand the recovery modalities that are out there. There are a number of recovery modalities. The well-variety movement, for example, is a strong recovery modality. And then to also be very grounded in the healing ceremonies that exist within my people, but also that exist across other tribes, and to be able to understand the ways of tribal ceremonies and feel blessed when I'm included in some of those ceremonies that occur with other tribes and the work that we do. And that's I think is a responsibility that some of us carry and work really hard to employing with veterans who are among us and with us every day. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, with our ways being banned for centuries. A great change has begun since 1978, when we were given permission to begin exercising our traditional ways without impediment. And since 1978, we're seeing a growth movement towards better incorporating, coming out with our traditional ways a lot more openly, as opposed to holding them secretly or without sharing. A lot of the ceremonies that happened before 1978 were within families and very private. And I think leads to some of the mistaken opinion and teachings that traditional ways aren't to be shared. When you think about the map earlier, there was a lot of dynamic relationships. Traditional ways were shared thoroughly. But I think what I see today and is a lot, among my people, quite a few more younger ones practicing traditional ceremony, learning traditional ceremonies, and offering traditional ceremony to more of our people. That was less so 20 years ago. Much of our knowledge keepers in the traditional ways were elders. Now we're seeing more of our younger people begin to pick up these ways, and this drawing really depicts the process that we go through in terms of contemplating and thinking through how we're going to approach the well-being of veterans and families and communities in our communities. It's not a process that is done on a whim or without some serious contemplation. Next slide. Once again, because of the historically dynamic relationships that we've had among our people, and now beginning to see a rebirth of that, I think, these are good times to acknowledge the blessings that we have and to ground ourselves in the Navajo we say, in the beautiful way, the good way of living, so that we have respect for each other as human beings and respect for each other as people. And when we attain that kind of respect and affirm each other's sacredness as a people, human beings, then we begin to share what is around us and share the beauty of living in life, and begin to make our journeys as veterans a lot more healing and much less traumatic laden. And this is a teachings that I've been offered by my healers and the mentoring work that I do with our traditional healers. It's a blessing. We look for, we acknowledge the beauty that's around us, and really keep ourselves grounded that way, and makes our life a lot better that way. Next slide. The Navajo were taught that on one hand, we carry the beautiful practices that we have, like the corn pollen. On the other hand, we carry those practices that protect us, like the arrowhead. And we have deities and beings among us that remind us that we are bounded to be peaceful people, respectful people, humble people. But on the other hand, we also must be aware that there are bad things around us, there are bad people around us. We always need to be careful about being able to protect ourselves and our families and our communities when that time comes. But that's not the primary way that we are meant to be as human beings. Our primary way is to be good people, helping people. And when the time comes to be in conflict, to be able to take up that weapon, to be able to take up the tools that are available to protect ourselves and not be overwhelmed or not be taken over or not be threatened in a way that affects our good way of life. And these are the two ways that I see most of our processes work. And I think really for me shows how our people were able to have such dynamic relationships prior to colonization. And these are the things that we teach each other in many of the veterans activities that I see going on, like the gore dance and embrace ceremonies that they get to take part in. So that's a historical, cultural perspective that I offer, and move it back on and give it back. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Really appreciate that. So much knowledge, so much wisdom being shared. I really appreciate that. Lots more obviously thought-provoking questions in the Q&A. So we'll get to those after we get through Ivan's presentation. But thanks again, Ray. Appreciate you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go ahead and now turn it over to Ivan Sam, who is going to present on healing methods and coping strategies for tribal vets and their families. Ivan, take it away.
I would like to greet each and every one of you. Introduce myself in Navajo. She Ivan Sam and Kia Ani and Shalom Tohe Leni Bashish Chain. Kamahanda Che do my description Dashanella without the Nensla. I'm originally from Hunters Point, Arizona, on the Navajo Nation. The reason why I introduced myself in Navajo is because what Ray was just talking about, identifying ourselves within this world that we live in. When we are brought into this world, we're born with a footprint, that we walk on this earth, regardless of where we go and what direction we walk. We're always identified as who we are, knowing that we have this connection with our holy beings, our creator, to be able to connect and have that identity to say, this is who I am and this is how I am on this earth. And, to build that communication and that relationship with our, the natural law that we live around, So I just want to say yad to my brother, Ray. It's good to hear him talk about his teachings and the wisdom and values that he carries as well. So I want to go into healing methods and coping strategies for Native American veterans and their families. Next slide. The purpose is to share a variety of healing methods that can help veterans find healing and coping strategies to overcome the struggles of PTSD, anxiety, depression, sexual trauma, and many other struggles that veterans deal with. And also to share a variety of traditional healing practices, ceremonies, and other holistic healing modalities that veterans have benefited from and healed from as well. Next, please. So ceremonies, there's many different varieties of ceremonies. We have sweat lodge, Native American church, enemy way ceremonies, cedar prayer, smudging prayer, vision quest, and gore dance. I want to go back to what Barbara was talking about. Our people had already had this trauma-informed care practice from an indigenous perspective. Many of these ceremonies focused on centering and bringing family together and everyone moving in that process of healing. So bringing balance into life and also centering the person in the present space that they're in at the moment. So a lot of times, what we experience in a traumatic experience, we go through this experience where it becomes a part of us. Our spirit becomes affected by a lot of this traumatic experience. And many times our resiliency is what gets us out of a lot of those struggles. So for us to really focus on ceremony, the purpose is to come back and be centered, come back and have balance and heal through that process. So in ceremony, sweat lodge is a good practice to bring center and bring, that healing that person needs. Maybe during that sweat lodge, you're going through a lot of different thoughts and processes, but also your body is going through this process where it's detoxifying itself through the sweat lodge too. As your body, gets rid of those toxins, you're also taking in good healing medicine. A lot of the herbs that they use in sweat lodge as well. Native American church, what Ray was talking about through shared culture, different practices that had happened. A lot of tribes throughout history have shared different ceremonies with one another, especially having the common practice to use corn as a healing method, using corn as a medicinal food, and also to really honor our relatives. What does it really mean to utilize the corn? What does the purpose of corn, bring to a family? A staple of food. It's a prayer. It's an element that is used for blessings. So through that process, as we move along through that historical trail, the tradings that had happened, it wasn't just objects that were traded. It was also ceremony and discussions, and a lot of times where people had to learn many different languages as well. So throughout time, that Native American church was practiced in that way, where a lot of tribes didn't really find healing through their own ceremonies, and they had to adopt other ceremonies to really find that healing. um, One big example is back in the mid 1800s, when a lot of tribes were relocated into Oklahoma during the Indian Territory. Um, a lot of tribes had to give up their ways. They had to, move away from a lot of their medicinal places where they used to gather herbs and medicines. So when they came into Oklahoma, a lot of them, adopted that Native American church using the peyote that came from down south, from the Mexican tribes and moving up north. And I hear a lot of testimonies of how this medicine traveled up north, even into Canada as well. So finding those ways to heal, to find a balance in their lives through that process. And then enemy way ceremony as well. We talk about, how Ray was mentioning about there's a blessing way, there's a blessing practice that we do, but there's also this practice of protection. There's a part of us that has this warrior spirit within ourselves. We carry this warrior spirit, and we are able to learn how to become a warrior. Our relatives, our elders, they teach us how to process different struggles in life. And being able to gain that warrior spirit, you're able to you know find a place for it, the right time, when to pick up that weapon and when to find that protection ceremony. So a lot of times when our warriors, when they go get deployed nowadays, they usually seek out protection way ceremonies, and then they get deployed. But through that process, they go through their campaign. When they return home, there's also a practice where they have to be put through a ceremony to cleanse their spirit. A long time ago, our ancestors always had this place of healing before they returned home, because they understood that the traumatic experience of wartime, and the struggles of what war brings, there's also a spirit that comes and follows as well. So this enemy way is what was utilized during this time, so to decompress the warrior and bring balance and centering them back to the present moment, to heal through that process. They were able to go through that change in these places, these camps that they were put up. And then a few days later, they returned back to their people, where they were able to focus on being around family again. And then a lot of other ceremonies like cedar prayer, smudging prayer, a lot of it's mostly cleansing the spirit, smudging the person down, saying a good prayer for them. And then vision quest is a form of meditation, finding that place, who you are as a Native person, you know, reconnecting with the spirit to identify who you are and how to get, you know, guidance and support through that vision quest. Um, some people say, you know, animals come to visit them, you know, just to reaffirm that, you know, we're connected with those spirits as well. And then gourd dance, you know, is a form of healing where, you know, it brings you back into this place where we gain something from an animal. The red wolf is what taught us in a good way like that. How to take care of ourselves and purify our spirits in this dance ground. So a lot of times when our warriors nowadays, this dance came from a warrior society. For example, like the Kiowa people, the Black Legging Warrior Society was the one that carried this gourd dance for healing for their warriors. And then throughout time, as we come into this contemporary place where we're at today, you know, our warriors are considered these veterans and these active duty service members that go out and become deployed during wartime or during campaigns. So when they come back home, you know, they're introduced to these societies as well to heal and become a part of a warrior society or a family that does the gourd dance to find healing through that process. And that picture here, and it just gives an example. You know, I was brought in that way. You know, it wasn't something I really asked for, but you know, some people identified that, you know, the hardship of what work can do. You know, I was brought into the society to heal, so I've become a part of that. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so when we go back to talking circles, there's also many different discussions that happen. There's confidentiality that we carry within our circles as well. The discussion amongst, you know, our people, there's a time and place to have those discussions, especially when it becomes wartime or, you know, when people discuss war, you know, there's only a certain place these discussions happen. Many times our elders used to always say, keep the children away. Do not expose them to those discussions or those talking circles where people discuss those, you know, disputes or conversations that, you know, lead to those traumatic experiences, you know, because the spirit that comes into this world is innocent, you know, as a child, you know, it becomes untampered. So the more we expose our children to trauma, it becomes a part of their spirit. And a lot of times, you know, they get caught up into that, you know, traumatic experience, you know, what we call vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma, you know, where someone else's traumatic experience becomes another person's life, even though that person may not experience the traumatic experience, but you know, that spirit of it, you know, it becomes a part of them, it jumps onto them. So a lot of times our elders used to always say, don't bring the children around these discussions because, you know, that vicarious trauma can become a part of their life process too. So a lot of times these men's talking circles, they happen in a place or an environment where, you know, they're alone within their own groups. And then we got the women's talking circle, vice versa. It's the same thing. You know, women have a certain discussion, you know, just for themselves as well, because, you know, there's a lot of things that have to be made sense of who we are as an individual. And sometimes we need that guidance from our own elders, you know, our grandmothers or our aunties that are able to instill some of these values into our women, especially the ones that are in need of those discussions and making sense of a lot of those talks. And then we also have like medicine wheel circle where, you know, we talk about recovery, what Ray was mentioning about recovery as well. You know, when we talk about, you know, how to move on during our process with struggling with substance abuse. Sometimes we have to have those discussions and going back, where did all this start? Where did we fall off that path? Getting back into a program that's going to help us process, getting back on that path, from a recovery perspective, having those discussions and bringing balance and recentering ourselves through that process, utilizing programs like the White Bison program or the Native Wellness programs that, share a lot of those trainings and practices of healing. And then there's also healing discussions. Some relatives or veterans, they live in a moment of survivor's guilt, during wartime. They've lost, friends and maybe relatives too. Sometimes those discussions have to happen at a certain level where, the veteran wants to have those discussions with certain people that they are seeking help for. So, a lot of those discussions, they come up, and then there's peacemaking. Maybe there's disputes that happen. Sometimes we have to, come to a mediator, to have those discussions. Sometimes we have to be in an environment where, we have to have smudging involved too, to bring that peace and the I guess the beautiful healing ways that we have, bringing that vibe and energy. Grieving is also a place where we have these discussions for Healing Circle, losing loved ones or even family members. Sometimes we have to make sense of it all to really have those discussions with our relatives, our elders. Next slide, please. So we got tribal and ceremonial art as well. That is also a healing modality. A lot of our indigenous people have a way of expressing themselves, and sometimes reconnecting with our spirituality, we have to create sacred items. Our ceremonies, like our blessing way ceremonies, our enemy way ceremonies, also focuses on creating a medicine bag for yourself too. Sometimes we need to recreate something sacred for ourselves to put sacred items in, maybe tobacco, herbs, or even a totem to put into those medicine bags, and keeping something sacred to you. So, through this process, there's also like a lot of deep art engagement that's happening, where there's an active listening happening. As you're building this medicine bag, you're able to process a lot by hearing someone talk about, the creation story of why we have to utilize these medicine bags, or why we have to utilize these certain paraphernalia items. So creating these sacred items gives you a sense of sacredness, and also being on that path to healing. Sometimes you have to express yourself in a certain way. So a lot of times our people are always expressing their art on sacred items like a feather fan or drumsticks, medicine bags. They create these little designs within the medicine bags. So beadwork is also, a way of healing, sharing a lot of different ways of beading, lazy stitch to peyote stitch to loom stitch. A lot of our tribes have adapted, sharing a lot of these teaching methods with one another, finding healing through that process. I talked about ceremonial art. A lot of times we're also through our healing process and ceremonies, sometimes we envision certain designs within our healing process, maybe a vision quest or maybe a meditation can bring a certain design or healing pattern to us, and we're able to interpret that into a sacred item. So a lot of times, art is healing in that way. So sometimes we have to utilize art as a healing path as well. Next slide, please. And I brought up equine therapy because horses have always been an important part of our indigenous history and culture. A lot of times our people have utilized horses to, carry stuff, to haul important, heavy, objects, or even move stuff around, or utilize for farming, or even traveling, going on hunting raids or hunting parties, to bring food back. There was a lot of many different purposes of utilizing the horse. There were stories that go along with horse stories, how the horses were utilized to help the people, or certain horse songs that are sung for our warriors to honor our horses. How the horse brings healing. What does the horse really represent? How did the horse come into our world? The mane represents the falling rain, and the back of the horse represents the rolling hills. The hooves represents, the thundering sound. And my grandfather used to always say the horse used to always run towards the storm, because they were created through that too. And building that relationship with horses in that way also brings a lot of healing. As time has gone, the horse was created a certain way to become that sacred animal. And horse provides, veterans and their families a door into working through challenges, great and small, whether improving communication, increasing responsiveness to the needs of self and others, or practicing skills related to managing trauma and anxiety. They always say the horse has an extra sense where it can read a person. It's able to build that relationship with the person if they come with a good heart. They could also, sense that a person has gone through trauma too. So a lot of times, they become irritable in those moments. So, working with horses brings a sense of healing where, they're able to calm the veteran down, to reconnect with them, building a bonding connection, helping veterans to focus on, present moments, creating problem solving skills where, how to build a relationship with the horse. As you're working with those horses, you're able to connect with them in that process, creating coping strategies, with PTSD, depression, anxiety. It helps veterans to keep calm and have more confidence. So that was just one of those things, coming from an indigenous perspective. This is another method how we find healing. Our veterans can connect from that indigenous perspective to honor the horse and find that repurpose of keeping that sacred animal around. Next slide. And then we have community gatherings that are more of this contemporary life that we live in now. A lot of us have to have family around to be a part of that healing process. It's important that we have peers around us, like Barbara was mentioning. Our peers is what really help us, find guidance too. Many times, I was always told in order for a veteran to heal, they need other veterans around to help that veteran go through that process. Community healing, potlatches, Sundance ceremony, enemy way ceremony, winter chants, bird singing gatherings, powwows, gourd dance, and bear dance. These are just many of the ceremony gatherings that, family come together. They bring their shared items that they would like to share with the family. Maybe it's food or gifts, for the sponsor or the patient. And then we also got, like what Ray was talking about, Wellbrighty programs that do events big gathering sobriety programs that they utilize. In these programs, they also have indigenous perspectives where, they're able to bring community together and share a lot of these different workshops that are able to help, relatives heal through that process as well. And then we also have the Gona. Some of you are probably familiar with the Gona process, the gathering of Native Americans. Personally, I think, we should have one for tribal veterans and their families as well in the future to create that sense of belonging. That's one of the most important things, being a part of a Native community. Our veterans need that place where they belong, and then working on mastery, how to process and redefine their path. And then that interdependency around family too. Our Native people are always interdependent with one another. When we have ceremony, we depend on one another. When we have family around, we need our peer support to have that interdependency with one another to move through that healing process. So everyone moves forward together. And then generosity is one of the most important things too, learning how to give back to our community. As a warrior leaving the military, we try to give our warriors another purpose in life, which is to come back to community. That could be a part of a healing process for them to learn, those skills and becoming a protector for the community. When they went into the military, they put their oath down to protect and serve, the Constitution of the United States, to serve their country. But, when they come out of the military, we repurpose that place for them to get involved in ceremony and coming back to be a part of the community with relatives around the circle, and redefining their purpose, being a protector within the community to hold ourselves accountable in that way, to support one another. So through that process, those are the important process of what community gathering is. Next slide. And that's it. I mean, if anyone has questions, we're here to listen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ivan. I'm going to go ahead and just start jumping into the questions because we have, and correct me if I'm wrong, Angela or Dwayne, is it about 12 minutes that we have for questions?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the questions so we can get through as many as we can here. One of the first questions we got was how do you process the conflict with the Native American community serving in the military and living in a country that oppresses you? I'll just open that up to our presenters, and we're obviously some of these questions, right, are a larger discussion, but if we can, in the most concise way that we can, answer some of these questions. And so I'll open it up to the presenters. If you want me to repeat that, I can, but essentially it is, how do you process the conflict with the Native American community of serving in the military and living in a country that oppresses you? Go ahead.
I can take a shot at that.
Thank you, Barbara. Go ahead.
Okay, I was just thinking about what Ivan was saying, and I think something like the Gona, the Gathering of Native Americans, is a good, a good format for doing that, a platform, because it uses stories, and he talked about stories, and traditional stories, and there are a lot of our stories that that really talk about, how we deal with conflict, how there's this struggle within us. And I can think of a number of stories that I would think if someone was at a Gona, because I think we're looking at things such as, moral injury. We're also looking at conflict. But there we have a lot of traditional stories that gently bring that conversation in, but then allow us to have conversation around it, because I think you're right. It's really an important discussion to get some closure and understanding of how, why there's such a large number of Native people that serve when there has been such a history of historical trauma and oppression.
I can see the tone, the question, I get this a lot and I hear this a lot about, how do you process this, right? You're a veteran who are serving in a military that essentially has oppressed natives, historically speaking, right? And the way I've heard it answered at times is that, why, and a lot of people say, why do you serve? Why do you even serve a country that, oppresses you and things
So
we're naturally protectors of the lands, right? And warriors, a warrior people. I'm gonna go ahead, Ivan, you're gonna chime in there. I'm gonna let you go ahead and answer that, but that was a good answer that I
my grandfather used to always say, my grandfather was a Navajo code talker. He served 7 different campaigns during in the South Pacific in World War II. So a lot of times he used to always say, we fought for our culture, our language, to keep our traditions. So he says, that's the war we fought, is to preserve that. Because if we go through another change of different languages, we're going to go through another change where we're going to lose more of our culture and our language. So he says, this was a calling where, our warriors stepped up. And our native people have always been involved in every war campaign since the birth of America. So it's not just recently, it's a part of history, is to protect and preserve what we have today. And it's a part of that warrior spirit too. We have to preserve and take care of our lands and our family, our relatives, our traditions.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. How do you address ceremony with veterans who have not grown up on the reservation and or do not live near their relatives? Ray, do you want to take a shot at that one?
Sure. I think these days, in pretty much all urban communities that I'm aware of, there are Native programs available to Native veterans to participate in. One of the, I think, great opportunities we have today that are things like like the veterans outreach efforts that are going on all over the place. There's a real good connection. In terms of traditional practices, one of the things that we are aware of is that there's been a strong emphasis by VA to have Native practitioners available in the programs that they serve and operate, especially in urban Native communities. And so I see those opportunities there, and I think a good number of us who are traditionally oriented make ourselves available also to our urban brothers and sisters that are out there. I mean, some of us travel literally miles and miles to participate in things that are happening in urban centers that we don't live in. So I think there's a strong emphasis on reaching out, and then for providers that are not Native or not traditionally oriented, to look at the resources that are available around them. I don't know of any place right now that doesn't have a resource person or resource group that they can reach out to.
Thank you for that, Ray. I appreciate it. But we have a question from James Reed, Marine veteran, who asks, yes, we are discussing traditional healing practices, but how do you also include those who are non-traditional but are Christian in their beliefs? Barbara, do you want to take that one?
Can you ask the question again, please?
Yeah, essentially that's asking, we're talking about traditional healing practices. How do we include people that are non-traditional but are Christian in their beliefs?
To me, you're looking not at the practice and how it manifests, but the value behind the practice, which is
Mhm.
spirituality, you know? And so that would be where, if I was doing, I would take a biblical story, a Christian story, but really begin to focus on the value behind that practice. How does that hold you? I often will call it, what is the rebar? That you have spiritual rebar, whether it comes through the traditional practice or the Christian practice, those are the things. And I'd come back to helping that person be able to see that. Ray, were you going to make a statement about it too?
No, I think you approach it well.
I agree. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
Now I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question about, let's see here. With somebody asked that with limited access to subject matter experts, are there suggestions of how to best provide ceremonies and traditional practices without overextending their subject matter experts? Um, that's a kind of a tough one there, right? If you have limited access, you're in an urban area. Um, that's a little bit difficult. I mean, I could say off the top that networking, right?
Mhm.
Connecting with folks like you all are subject matter experts and panelists here. But
Mhm.
also, there's groups like National Congress of American Indians, National American Indian Veterans, and our Secretary of Veterans Affairs Tribal Advisory Committees would be some
Mhm.
good places to start. But do you guys have any other feedback or suggestions of how to provide those type of ceremonies and traditional
Mhm.
practices?
I think in terms of networking and developing access, one of the really good tools that are available is through social media. There are a good number of healing oriented, recovery oriented, and treatment oriented pages and groups on social media that can be tapped into locally and regionally to be able to network out. And that's one resource. And also to like you said, to network as best as you can with the regions that you are or the communities that you are to be able to gain more knowledge and experience.
Appreciate it. I want to get this one in right away too. This is a common question. Why doesn't the military take responsibility for their own neglect of soldiers that have MST, PTSD, trauma, or this and then they stand on deniability? Um, right? That's a common question. And I wrote a little short reply to that I'll let you
Mm-hmm.
guys build on it. And that the simple answer is that the military does a good job of training war fighters, right? But is not great at helping those warriors transition back home afterwards. And I just put a note on there that it's a work in progress.
I
Better.
think I think it's a matter of roles. Uh, the armed forces is their role is to train and provide a military force, and the VA's role is to work on on work on those needs and services for military veterans who come out of service. And I think that's how the system's been created. I look at the VA now and compare it to how it is or was 50 years ago. It's a remarkable uh, change in terms of how the VA reaches out and works at connecting with veterans across the country. Within our tribal communities, our own tribes have really done a good job at creating tribally centered veterans organizations that are not part of uh, the national veterans groups. And there are resources too. Here in my land, we have a number of veterans groups that are Navajo centric, and we encourage our veterans who are Navajo living in Phoenix and Albuquerque to join meetings and participate. So I think um, our young men and women can have access to resources that certainly weren't there 20, 30 years ago. It's a matter of how we as providers access them ourselves and make them known to our people. The 988 line, for example, is really great resources that we underutilize as a profession, let alone for veterans. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Appreciate that.
Mhm.
Okay, well, we did our best to get through all the questions. I think we got to most of them. I just want to thank everybody again for joining today. And we just want to have our wrap-up slide here with our contact information here. The SAMHSA's SMVF TA Center, and email address there as well. Feel free to reach out, please, to contact us if there's further discussion you'd like to have. I know myself and the presenters are more than happy to engage. You don't get often a lot of times to connect with subject matter experts and Native veterans issues. So I understand if there's more discussion that you'd like to have. So please do feel free to reach out. And just once again, thank everybody, the presenters, everybody who took the time out to join us today to learn about this. I learned a lot myself. We appreciate everybody for being here today. And thank you to our SAMHSA. Appreciate you. Miigwech.